Bonjour à tous, c'est un test des micros de la salle W. Test des microphones de la salle W.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this vital session on the future of low-emission steel value chains. As it's well known, the steel industry stands at a crossroad, one of the largest contributors to global greenhouse emission, close to 8%, and also a very internationalized industry with nearly 25% of global steel production crossing borders annually. So the integration of sustainable practices into this industry is not just an environmental necessity, but a critical trade issue. To provide context, one estimate of the cost of decarbonizing the global iron and steel industry by 2050 was around exceeding 2 trillion. So today's session is about exploring how trade can be a catalyst in the transformation of the steel industry. We are here to discuss how trade policies can support the entire life cycle of the steel, from extraction to finished goods, in a way which is both commercially viable and environmentally sustainable. A vital piece of this puzzle is ensuring that we measure emission in a coherent and transparent manner. The WTO Secretariat, together with our partners of the World Steel Association and many of the endorsing organizations, have been supporting this effort through the Steel Standard Principle. We will have the opportunity of discussing them. Before moving into the discussion of the panel about this green steel revolution, I would like to invite Dr. Okondro-Iweala, our DG, to provide opening remarks to our session. Thank you, DG, for being there.
Thank you. So good morning, everybody. This to me is a very important session, and I'm really glad to welcome all of you. I just thought all of us would be wearing green. I can only see 2 or 3 of us in the room in green, because this is green steel, a very important subject. But I must start by thanking Jean-Marie, Yuvan, the rest of the team for their hard work in trying to make this partnership come together. So ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this session on how trade can contribute to reducing the carbon footprint of the steel industry. Let me begin by thanking our panelists and our audience, you, for joining us today. The discussion on reshaping low-emission steel value chains is both timely and directly relevant to this public forum's focus on reglobalization and inclusive trade. As the world pursues net zero greenhouse gas emissions, decarbonization is poised to transform value chains in agriculture, manufactured goods, and services. I'm one of those people who strongly believes that climate change is an existential threat, and that we must try in every way possible to find ways and means to help reach the global objective of decarbonizing and reaching a net zero emissions by 2050. And trade and the WTO can really be part of this solution. The most radical transformations will be necessary in the hard-to-abate sectors: heavy industry, shipping, aviation. The iron and steel sector alone accounts for roughly 8% of total global greenhouse gas emissions. We can't do without steel. It's the backbone of our infrastructure, our industries, and our households. And it's a big bone of contention at the WTO, as you know, over the years. And that is why reshaping steel value chains to reduce emissions is so important. The scale of emissions reductions needed and the new technologies, inputs, and production processes taking shape to make these cuts possible make big changes inevitable in the way steel and other emissions-intensive value chains operate. The good news is that these changes are creating major new opportunities for countries and companies as comparative advantages shift to meet the needs of a net zero economy. A logic of green comparative advantage is emerging, just as individuals and countries can reap economic gains by specializing in what they are relatively good at. The world can reap environmental gains if countries specialize in what they are relatively green at. And this is what we had to say in our World Trade Report last year. The ability of a country to provide low emissions inputs to a value chain is becoming a competitive advantage. And we see that clearly in the steel sector. Consider Mauritania. It has strong renewable energy potential together with some of Africa's largest deposits of high-grade iron ore. Put these together and you have the makings of a green comparative advantage in the low-emission steel value chain. Renewable energy would be used to make green hydrogen, which in turn would be the fuel to produce green iron. Green iron produced in Mauritania could then be shipped to Europe to forge green steel in a manner that is both more cost efficient as well as climate efficient. This is just one example of how industrial decarbonization is opening new avenues for partnerships, trade, growth, and increased value addition within developing countries. South Africa and other countries are similarly well positioned with the potential for win-win outcomes that lower the overall cost of the steel industry's green transition. Reconfiguring value chains to cut emissions, prevent biodiversity loss, and conserve natural resources is an environmental imperative, but can also be a force for greater social and economic inclusion if we can bring in people and places that offer good business climates, but remain on the margins of global value chains. As the green transition progresses, first movers in emissions-intensive industries, such as the iron and steel sector, are poised to take advantage of these changes and reap green market opportunities. Today, we are joined by a variety of important stakeholders in the iron and steel sector, from both upstream and downstream, including steel producers, automotive companies, industry associations, and standards bodies. Many of you have already been involved in some important steps forward for the sector's green transformation, and we in the WTO Secretariat have been proud to support these efforts. One example of this is the Steel Standards Principles initiative that we launched at last year's COP in Dubai. It seeks to align how we measure emissions in the sector and has good traction with a range of stakeholders. I understand it counts more than 50 endorsers from steel companies, standard-setting bodies, international organizations, and industry associations, including several who are joining the panel today. I was delighted to help launch this in Dubai. The work on standards is a promising example of cross-sectoral collaboration and public-private partnership that is making trade work for green. This kind of collaboration and support will be crucial as we work to leverage green comparative advantage and integrate more developing countries into new green value chains, simultaneously fostering socioeconomic inclusion and environmental sustainability. As I mentioned earlier, developing countries are poised to play a growing role in a decarbonized iron and steel sector, particularly upstream, with large high-grade iron ore infrastructure projects being developed in Africa, in Asia, and the Middle East. Green iron ore corridors that take into consideration the changing geographical patterns of iron and steel making have the potential to add value in developing economies, optimizing steel making processes whilst minimizing climate damage. This whole effort is part of what we also see as what we call reglobalization. We're trying to encourage a reimagining of the way globalization works, to have critical value chains also developed within developing countries, creating jobs for the vast number of young people who will be there, whilst also achieving sustainability and environmental goals. So you're a very strong part of the reimagined globalization that we talk about. And I hope you will also use that term when you describe what you're doing, because I think is a very strong part of it. We look forward to hearing from you, the speakers on the panel, on how trade and trade policy can best support efforts to cut emissions from this sector, whilst creating opportunities, as I said, within developing countries and across the entire steel value chain for producers and consumers alike. Thank you, and I wish all of us a successful session.
Thank you, DG, and very happy to see that you are staying with us a little bit. Thank you for enlightening the road. Let us move to the discussion. I just want to very briefly introduce our very distinguished panel. We have Dr. Edwin Basson, Director General of the World Steel Association, Madame Anne van Isendyk, Vice President, Head of Government Affairs and Environment with ArcelorMittal, Adina René Adler, who is Executive Director of Global Steel Climate Council, Marc Delobel, Head of Fossil Free Material Purchasing with the Volvo Group, and Annie Hitton, that you know already in the WTO, I suppose, CEO Responsible Steel, to discuss with us. Without further ado, we are going to have 2 rounds of questions with panelists. If you can limit you to 4 or 5 minutes each for each round, so that we can leave room for questions from the audience. Without further ado, I'd like to move to you, Dr. Edwin Basson. Dear Edwin, as the Director General of World Steel, what are the key challenges and opportunities that you see for the global steel industry in this journey to the transition to low emission practices? The floor is yours. Yeah.
So if it's this color, it's okay.
That's fine. And
Okay.
then you have headphones when you want to listen to the room.
I had to ask whether this is the right color for the thing, and maybe this refers Director General to your remark. Why am I not wearing green today? I was born colorblind, so unless my wife deceives me, I am wearing green today. You asked, Jean-Marie, what are the challenges? I think if we look at the steel industry today, firstly, there is globally a significant consolidation of support towards this objective of decarbonization. We know it can be done, at least in theory. We do have some sight of solutions that can be implemented at the short term, but also in the longer term. And I think that brings me to probably the only common constraint that we have on a global basis in this process of decarbonization, and that is time. A shortness of time within the industry to, in the shorter term, really build the new installations that can produce steel at lower CO2 emissions on a per unit basis, do the investments that are required and the training of staff that are required to be able to produce a portion of what we produce at decarbonized steel level, the CO2 levels in the short term. In the longer term, there is also a requirement for time to continue with research and development work that we do to reduce CO2 emissions in many of the other procedures and processes that we have in our industry. We know that from laboratory experimentation, it is possible, but we need to move it from the laboratory to the factory, and that takes time as well. So this is the one major constraint that we face as an industry, is implementation time. There's a second implementation time constraint, which does not sit within the industry, but sits within industries around the steel industry. And as one example, I will use what is happening in the energy industry. The role of hydrogen as a reductant in our industry is a key component of future decarbonization strategies. However, hydrogen has to be produced, and to produce that in a decarbonized way, we need large amounts of low CO2 energy bases, which is currently not possible or available in the industry. Yes, there is a lot of work being done to upgrade energy systems around the world, but again, this takes time, this takes investment, and it takes a willingness from society to move in this direction. I am confident it will happen, but it cannot happen overnight. And for us, that brings the second large constraint in our industry on our journey towards decarbonization. We are hopeful, though, despite these constraints, that already by 2030, we will begin to see some visible reduction in CO2 on a global basis in our industry. Some of the evaluations that we've done shows that by 2040, we can reliably expect to have a reduction of around about 500 million tons of CO2 emissions from our industry on a global basis. This is almost a 20% reduction on where we are today. So as we sit here, despite the constraints of time, the constraints of funds and training and research and development that I've highlighted, I am quite confident that the global steel industry is on a track that will help it to reduce CO2 emissions, and this will be visible by 2030 and 2040 already.
Thank you very much, Edwin. Crystal clear and very, very clear roadmap. And from your company perspective, how do you approach a balance between industrial growth, environmental sustainability, and what can we do with trade policy tools in our hands here in WTO in particular to support?
Good morning. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. So I'm representing ArcelorMittal. For those of you who don't know ArcelorMittal, we are a truly global steel company present in Europe, where we are the largest producer, but also North America, South America, Africa, Ukraine, etc. And so this gives us basically a very good understanding, I think, of the situation in these various regions. We have been working on our climate agenda for several years now, and we launched the first publication in 2019 with our climate action report. And I think what we said, the headlines of that report is still, I think, very relevant for today's discussion. At the time, in a nutshell, we pointed out that there are different technologies available to decarbonize steel. So one based on clean energy or like low carbon electricity that can be used in the furnaces, or directly, or as Edwin also said, as in the form of clean or low carbon hydrogen. There is a route based on sustainable biomass or on carbon capture, so usage or storage. And all of these different technologies are really necessary to reach carbon neutrality in the steel industry. We cannot do without all of the three. Developing the technologies is a challenge, but we believe this can be overcome. Also, Edwin hinted already at that. But already at the time, we identified the bigger obstacles that are the lack of supporting policy, and which has a catalytic role to play in the decarbonization, and the availability and affordability of clean energy that we need so crucially to decarbonize the segment. So we are now 5 years down the line, and the question is, where are we now and what has actually changed? So maybe we start with the positives. Quite a lot has been done, obviously. We as a company, for example, have set out our commitment and ambition, net zero by 2050, and we are targeting 25% reduction of emissions by 2030 with a specific target for Europe, which is higher, which is 35%. We have developed and launched a number of industrial scale technology pilots. We have a biomass project at our plant in Ghent. We have a CCU project also in our plant in Ghent. We have CCS projects in several plants, Ghent and Dunkirk. We have also tested already using green hydrogen to a larger extent in our DRI plant in Canada. We are completing engineering for all our European projects this year. And we have established a low carbon emission steel brand, which is called XCarb. And we have heard also some of the working groups and work streams that are going on, for example, at the WTO and World Steel level on standards. So all of this is very good. But on the other side of the coin, I think we have to point out also the problems. So I think it's very widely acknowledged that steel is a hard to abate sector. And what Edwin already also hinted at, there has not really been any meaningful progress in developing clean energy infrastructure. And that is really one of the biggest problems that we are facing for the decarbonization. Also, policy has evolved, but we still see that all the pieces of the puzzles are not there, and certainly not everywhere in the world. Regions are all evolving very differently in terms of priorities and in terms of choices on how to achieve the decarbonization. And arguably most importantly, and this gets, I think, really to the heart of the question that you asked, steel is globally traded, we heard it already, and highly competitive and highly cyclical as an industry, which means that if you're not cost competitive, you are having a really big problem. So we need to remain competitive as we decarbonize, and we need to see a return on all our investments. Our transition must make business sense as well as climate sense, and we need to somehow make sure that this goes hand in hand. And whichever technology you look at today is still more expensive than the traditional route. So this is basically the crux of the problem. So the challenge we are wrestling with today is how do we decarbonize at scale? We're not talking about little pilots, at scale in a sustainable and economic way. And the short answer to that is, of course, that policy has a very big place to play here, and a role to play to support our industry's decarbonization. It will also depend in each region on availability, of course, of low carbon energy, of infrastructure, of raw materials, which will dictate the choices and combination of technologies. As I said, all the technologies are required to reach net zero. So at this stage, Europe, for example, remains one of the very few regions where we have a carbon price and has been introduced, and it's at a level much higher than elsewhere. Decarbonization in Europe focuses on electrification. This is just as an example. This means going from a globally traded raw material input, which is coal, which is more or less the same price everywhere, to something which is regionally or even locally traded in price, which is energy, electricity, so low carbon electricity. And in Europe, the electricity price is much higher than elsewhere. So this is already kind of painting the picture of what is the problem in decarbonization. There are significantly higher input prices if you want to go for electricity in Europe, and adding on the carbon price than, for example, elsewhere. So trade policy needs to recognize these issues and needs to be aligned with climate policies to facilitate widespread decarbonization, and whilst ensuring that the industry remains competitive. And there is a level playing field everywhere. So this is really the crux of the problem. The more international cooperation and alignment in all these policies, trade and environmental policies, is really required to get to scale in decarbonization. And this needs also, of course, including all the other regions. We heard all these potential projects that could be extremely interesting with low carbon energy at lower prices. But again, they need electricity, they need infrastructure, and they need alignment of policies. So I think we will dig into all of this during the debate. So I leave it at this for the moment.
Thank you. This is only the first one. Thank you very much. A very converging intervention. The word possible comes. So this is very rewarding and level playing field to get to scale up. Which brings me to turn to Adina, Renee Adler. Adina, I need to disclose that you have a very strong trade background. So we are a little bit relying on you to help us elaborate on what trade policy do you think are most critical to drive this global shift toward low carbon steel,
Okay,
particularly in developing countries.
no pressure. Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you so much, Jean-Marie. So yesterday I sat through a public forum session on trade policy and climate adaptation, and Vietnam's deputy permanent representative said something very succinctly. He said that his country's continued economic competitiveness hinges on their ability to adapt to climate change. And he wants to see more of the silos between trade policy and climate policy coming down. And I think that's already been happening and starting to happen. The fact that he said it maybe means that there needs to be more of that convergence. And I think that's why we're here, and that's why the WTO exists, and why we're here at the public forum. And it really is truly that nexus between trade and the environment, which is about using trade policy to fight climate change. We have a lot of tools in the toolbox. And so I see trade policy as thinking about the broader strategy, what it is that we're trying to accomplish, and then you draw on those tools. And I'm going to maybe tease out a few of those during my statement. I don't speak for the U.S. government, but I do want to note that in their communique earlier this year, they talked about promoting dialogue and building on existing work already in place, including that has already been touched on, such as in the Steel Standards Principles work, on data collection and emissions measurement methodologies. And just to quote the statement, they said, that if you promote dialogue, you can create greater coherence and interoperability of some of these existing frameworks to improve their effectiveness to fight climate change. And I think that's really important. And that we already know that within the WTO, there's a lot of work, especially within the trade and environmental sustainability structured discussions, or the TESD, where they have a particular focus on ensuring carbon measurement standards are not trade restrictive. They're looking at promoting opportunities for climate-friendly tech, such as in renewable energy, with which the steel industry is more and more relying upon. There's a lot of work on circularity. Steel is the most recycled material in the world, and how can that be promoted even more? So I'm the executive director of the Global Steel Climate Council. We're a coalition of steel companies that are making a very ambitious effort towards that net zero goal through decarbonization. And you know, these are companies that have had a climate strategy for decades. And so the GSCC is really kind of built on that same strategy, with great alignment with a lot of the core WTO tenets, starting with the TBT agreement, 6 principles. Transparency is like at the heart of everything that we do. All, you know, businesses need open, transparent, and predictable markets, which is a mantra here at the WTO. And so for us, that means making sure that all the methodologies, the calculations, the data, anything you want to know about how our members are going to get there is freely available. And of course, a lot of that is also verified by third parties to make sure that we're truthful in what we're saying. We're non-discriminatory. We are totally neutral when it comes to the type of production that can be pursued. We do have a number of companies in our membership from developing countries as well as developed countries. And we intend to be trade facilitative, because there are so many more regulations and border measures that are requiring carbon measurement that has been verified, and you know, we can present that for them. So just as a statement on like what is within that toolbox that could support this trade policy or this trade strategy. There's a lot of discussion about border tariff measures on, you know, that could support leveling the playing field. And I'm not here whether to endorse or not endorse border measures, but just, you know, I think they could potentially have a role. We just want to make sure that we avoid unintended consequences. Like, do we understand the concept of carbon leakage and how certain measures may or may not prevent one type of carbon leakage, but yet may have that unintended consequence of some other folks? I think we just need to be super focused on that. But sort of related to this, Jennifer Hillman brought this up at the beginning of the public forum, but there's been a lot of discussion, is how do you better define goods? Like, rather than their visual characteristics, but how can you think about goods from their greenness? How were they produced? What is that embodied carbon content look like? And I think, you know, sort of thinking about, you know, the tariff schedule in a little bit different way, or if there's a way to evolve that. I know that the WCO is thinking about that. Low carbon steel can and does make a net positive contribution to the environment, both directly with companies taking real emissions cutting, but also indirectly through the thousands of steel containing goods that we use in our everyday lives. I would love to see the environmental goods agreement negotiations come back in some form. I leave it to the experts to decide on that timing. But of course, that's a forum where you can give equal voice to all countries, especially the 75% of the WTO membership from the developing world. And I have another thought. I don't know if this is possible, but there's been a lot of talk this week about green finance. Well, not just this week, but obviously at the COP as well. Can tariff concessions be tied to that in some way, where if you help to facilitate technical assistance, capacity building? This session yesterday, I mentioned they talked about tech transfer. You know, if we can help upgrade, you know, the green bona fides of the developing world as part of this reglobalization effort, you can build and stimulate green supply chains in the countries all the way from sustainable mining of raw materials to the utilization of the new technologies that Edwin and Anne have also already talked about for green steel production, the production and use of the low carbon steel containing goods, and of course, all of the services and other sort of digitalization and ancillary support, to that is required to move and market these goods. All of that, could lift up the global economy, but in particular in the developing countries. Trade facilitation agreement, I think, also provides some important aspects and frame for supporting this. But I'd love to see more sectoral agreements. Can there be a trade facilitation for low carbon steel agreement, where that's very specific to the unique circumstances of this aspect of trade, where we can maybe see some of the work that we're doing on converging on standards could be integrated. I wanted to make a last statement on subsidies. Again, I don't support or not support subsidies. GSCC is a global organization. I do sit in Washington, so it's very close to watching the, our government's IRA funds are coming to the steel industry to help support their green transition. And I think I just want to note that, we want to make sure that we keep recipients accountable to meeting those carbon reduction goals. The goals should be ambitious, but they should be achievable. We want these policies to be equitable, but not discriminatory. If the intent is about achieving an environmental outcome, is it possible to make sure that those environmental outcomes are achievable? And I think public procurement is also another sort of government policy in the trade space that can really, it's a really powerful market signal, and one that could really drive decarbonization. But again, like subsidies, we just want to make sure that the environmental goals are not lost to maybe other political priorities. So I think I'll stop there.
Thanks a lot, Annie, for all this food for thought. I think the word interoperability is emerging all around the place here in the WTO, so we listen to that. I'm turning to you, Mark. Welcome. We know that Volvo wants to be seen at the forefront of integrating sustainability into its business model. How do you view the role of trade in accelerating the adoption of low emission steel in your industry, in the vehicle industry? The floor is yours.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for inviting me. And it's only music to my ears, but I heard this morning around the steel industry, and I'm really glad to see that everyone is getting together to try to find solution. Then just to set the scene, Volvo Group. So we are world leaders in commercial vehicle industry. We do truck, buses, construction equipment, marine, and industrial engines. And we are really a global organization because we are present in 190 markets globally, and we are producing in 18 countries. So you see a little bit of our landscape. But then when it comes to get a low emission material like steel, it's from our own supply chain partner. So here we have 50,000 tier ones globally, and 12,000 that are automotive supplier, meaning giving us component using material. So for it's really a big network globally. So you mentioned our ambition, Volvo Group. So we have in our strategy, it's embedded that we have our sustainability framework. We have 3 pillars with our climate, resource, and people. And for us, they are all equally important. But then if we talk emission, we will think a little bit more on climate. And here we have ambition to be net zero in all our value chain by 2040. And obvious first thing is to decarbonize the big hotspot, which is the usage that our customers are doing from our vehicles when they operate it. It's 95% of our emission today, if you take a life cycle assessment. So of course, we are working on solution, electrification, hydrogen is also part of our alternative, biofuels and so on. But then it's not enough if you want to really be a net zero, meaning we need to go deeper than that and look at the materials. And that's where steel is coming into the picture. 70% of our vehicles are made of steel and iron in weight. And in emission, it's 45%. So it's by far the biggest driver in our scope 3, you know, our upstream, all our supply chain emission. So steel is number one. And it's a global landscape, as you understood, compared to our footprint. And it was mentioned a bit earlier, there is a lot of way to produce steel. That means the emission factors, as we call it, is completely different depending on the region, the type of steel. So it's not, you can just take one figure and say, let's apply 45% on it. It's not at all like this. So we really need to go deep in our supply chain of 12,000 suppliers and see with each of them how they can improve. Because at the end, we want to improve for all of them. It's not just buying from one supplier that will have done the decarbonization journey. But it's a bit of jungle today. It's very wide. And what we started 3 years ago, we were the first OEM to introduce steel in serial production, fossil-free steel, which was made of hydrogen with direct reduction. And that was, of course, a pilot, was a little bit lower volume due to the market availability. But what we just announced, as a matter of fact, 2 days ago, is that for next year, we will introduce in serial production in large scale near zero emission steel, which just for next year will save over 6,600 tons of CO2. So that's our contribution to the big equation. Of course, the aim now is to do much more, but then we need availability and affordability. And that's where the role of trade will be very important. Because for instance, we have made some external commitment, like with we are founding member in the World Economic Forum for the First Mover Coalition, where we made commitment already that in 2030, we will have at least 10% of our global purchase, the global ones, that will be near zero emission. So now we need the offer to be there. And that's where we, in the trade, of course, Volvo Group, we promote and really believe in a free trade. And it's also, I talk about the people pillar being very important for us. It's also a matter for the prosperity to be equal, that every countries have the opportunity to contribute. And trade is key for us, and we use today several free trade agreements in our global operation, and therefore World Trade Organization is an important partner for us. And if we focus on steel, of course, what we want to achieve and what we would like trade to help is that it support to increase the investment and run all the transformation that has been mentioned for a more sustainable solution. And it make it an obvious things to do, that there is no debate around that it's really clear, and that it's an obvious that we should replace the fossil-based solution today to achieve this ambition. It's really key for us, actually. And we need global investment in that direction. It cannot be, for instance, that it's triggered by one continent, and because we need a supply chain resiliency, and we need to have a local operation feeded by all two solutions. And the market also, we need trade to help us to have the market accepting this solution. I mean, it needs to be there technically. I think there is a lot of good ideas, but also it needs to be affordable. So that's where we'll have to talk about what can be done. And you understood the importance of steel in all that. I mean, it's if it's 7-8% of the global emission, it's huge as a single sector. So there is a pivotal role to play here for the steel industry to decarbonize the footprint, and in turn help us to decarbonize the transport industry. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mark. I think some of your words about the depths of the supply chain and the global investment dynamics are going to resonate in this organization, because you may know that some of our members are negotiating an investment facilitation agreement, have been concluding actually. Moving now, last but not least, of course, to you, Annie, to ask you how can initiative like Responsible Steel support countries in becoming both producers and consumers of low emission steel, especially in light of the value chains angle that we have been discussing.
So look, just to link the question back to trade, when Responsible Steel was in its infancy 10 years ago, there were some very interesting discussions going on this very topic. And although we think that this question of low carbon steel as a trade issue is quite recent, 10 years ago, there were national initiatives, regional initiatives being developed that were, in our view, heading in the wrong direction because they were not global. They were looking at things from a national perspective. And so this is why responsible steel was developed to say if we're going to develop a standard for low emissions and responsible steel goes far beyond carbon, we need to do that on a global basis because we need to create a level playing field that enables trade in responsible steel, if you like. And so I think it's a very important reflection because where we are today, we've moved forward 10 years, and whilst we have international standards, we also see that national governments are developing their own policies, and their challenge is, do we use policies that we've developed and definitions that we've developed ourselves, or do we use international definitions? And so that's the role of international standards, is to enable the interoperability, I think, between what is defined at national level and what facilitates trade. So responsible steel is an international standard. We have developed that standard through a very trusted process of consensus building, not only amongst the steel industry, but also with civil society and academics to bring in a very broad group of stakeholders. Now, the standard is one thing, but really when you're talking of trade, you need some element of trust in what is the quality of the goods, and that means some kind of verification. In our standard system, we have a certification assurance scheme, which is third party, similar to what Adina has mentioned, and that creates a trusted mark. And that means that you know that what is claimed about that product has been third-party verified according to a trusted system. So already I've moved from what we've talked about around measurement to actual definitions, and I think this is where the real challenges arise. When we talk around measurement, this is actually quite straightforward. The standards world, we all talk to each other, we all know the ins and outs of carbon measurement, and responsible steel certainly didn't set out to invent a new standard. We built on the work of the ISO in the work that they've done on measuring the emissions from steelmaking, and what responsible steel set out to do was to enable that measurement to facilitate complete comparability between steel plants across the world, and indeed between steel products, because no two steel plants are alike, and certainly there are thousands of different grades of steel, different products. So if you actually want to compare the decarbonization progress of a steelmaker, you need to have a level playing field in definitions, in measurement. So that was the first thing that we did, and as I say, we built on ISO and we created a common boundary. Now, there's a lot of work, I'm very pleased to say, going on across standards organizations under the Steel Standards Principles and your great leadership, Deputy Director General, and that I think will really enable a common understanding of how to measure the emissions in steel. Responsible steel, we think there's more to it than that. There's all the other aspects of sustainability we need to take into account. But I leave that to one side for the moment, because there is great progress being made on the embodied emissions of steel and how you can enable good data, because trade relies on good data. Competition relies on good data. And the more comparable, consistent that data, the better the competition and the better the trade will flow and the finance will flow to fund that decarbonisation. So responsible steel plays a role within the Steel Standards Principles. We want to see a alignment as far as possible. And where that's not possible, we want to enable interoperability. And that will ultimately mean that a ton of steel that's measured under one system can be traded under another system. And I think the solution to that is in sight. So I think I'll leave my comments there on the measurement and the standards. But one thing I would say is that steel consumption in developing countries will continue to grow, and those countries need to be able to grow their steel industry whilst also reducing emissions. And so when we're thinking about how we define green steel, we need to take that into account. We need to take into account the fact that, I think has been mentioned on the panel already, that different countries have access to different resources. Everywhere in the world, we need new energy systems, but in some parts of the world, there is much less access to clean energy sources. There's much less access to high quality iron ore. There's much less access to CCS resources, and there's less access to scrap. So we have those natural inequalities across the world in terms of geological resources and economic resources. So we need to take that into account. So when we are thinking of creating level playing fields in trade, in emissions, in low carbon emissions, trade policy at the moment deals with carbon leakage and the cost of carbon, and create a level playing field in terms of what we're all paying for carbon emissions. I think we also need to take into account a level playing field in terms of achievability, and that's going to create that's going to take more than trade policy. That's going to take a lot of international collaboration in terms of other policies to enable that achievability across the world.
Thank you very much, Annie, and you're spot on in this link between trusted mark and third-party verified standards and the value that we can extract from this decarbonization. I move to the second round, but I have to ask my panelists to be a little bit shorter for the next round. 1 or 2 minutes. Seems like you are on CNN, not on not in the WTO for a minute, and so that we have a chance for question from the audience. I start again with you, Edwin. The question of competitiveness has been raised in particular by Anne, but all throughout the panel. What do you think are the most effective strategies in ensuring that this decarbonization will not compromise competitiveness in the steel sector?
Maybe just a word on competitiveness in the industry, the steel industry, which we all know it's common say the steel industry is a global and an open industry. That means that competitiveness in our industry to a large degree are depending on very similar forces for most producers wherever they are. For the bulk of their competitive position, all of them have to rely on raw materials purchased by and large from the same sources. All of them have to rely on transportation costs provided by and large by the same sources outside to the industry. Where the differences normally come in are to some degree access to energy and at which cost those energies are. And secondly, something which Anne has alluded to, what I would call induced differences to competitiveness in the industry. This is normally of a regulatory nature, which is local in origin in many cases, that says what you can or not allowed to do. Or in some cases, it has some protection motive behind this. Survival in this global open industry really depends on every producer being competitive on a global basis. And that implies that while we're all subject to the same forces, the real impact on competitive differentiation to a very effective part comes from these induced regulatory forces. And therefore, what we are talking about today is really the protection of a market positioning which is competitive, which allows steel as a material to flow from one location to another, because as an industry, as I said, the steel industry is open. More than 30% of what is produced in one location is consumed in a different continent, not even in a different company. So these equal access to allowing steel to flow from continent to continent is extremely important to the long-term sustainability and competitiveness of the industry. Annie mentioned developing economies that have a requirement for steel. Many of them have no production capability of steel, yet they need the product for their development purpose. And we should enable a trading system that allows steel to flow from the point of production to where it is required for economic development purposes. And therefore, the discussion that we have here about commonality in measurement systems, particularly as far as decarbonization efforts are concerned, I think is vital to the long-term competitive position of steel producers, but also the long-term survival of steel as an industry. I think this initiative that we've been talking about for the last, what is it now, 18 months or so, is a very worthwhile initiative. It's a very important initiative, and it should continue, and it should come to a logical, equitable conclusion for all of us in the industry. And I wish the discussions very, very good success in the next few days.
Thank you so much, Edwin. I take your word, induce differences. I think it's a very creative way of discussing what we do daily in the WTO on the many regulatory questions. Anne, back to you, CNN way, to let us know. So what kind of support do you think that concretely we can expect from trade policies or the WTO to achieve level playing field, decarbonization targets? Many things have been said, but does it ring a bell?
Yes, of course. It's a very, very important question. And I don't really want to repeat what has already been said, but we heard all the time about steel being truly global. A third of the steel is not consumed where it's being produced and needs to go into everywhere and in a competitive manner. I think really it goes again and again to, in order to kind of induce decarbonization at scale, we really need climate policies and trade policies to absolutely converge more and take away barriers instead of creating more and more barriers. And we heard just this creative way of induce differences. I come back again, and well, I mean, Europe is a good example because it has a policy maybe more ambitious and maybe more developed, and it has this ETS system with the carbon price. Now, in order to make this, the best would of course be having one globally accepted carbon price everywhere, but this is absolutely never going to happen. The standard discussion is extremely important, but also what is really important is to, again, go back to transparency, interoperability, and level playing field. And now, so the EU has recognized it needs an additional tool to the ETS, which is the carbon border adjustment mechanism, for example. Very highly discussed and disputed. We believe it's a very good thing, but for example, we believe it is not, as it is conceived for the moment, just as an example, it's not going to be really efficient. So there again, we see room for organizations like the WTO to maybe help pointing to these various tools that Adina has helpfully laid out, which seems to be ignored by a lot of politicians maybe in the short term, because there's a lot of short term and long term. And it would really make sense to make sure that there is more alignment and there is more common goals perceived at a global level, because decarbonization needs trade and needs global trade, needs it flowing, but it cannot flow if and decarbonization, as I've really said again already before, it needs to create a sustainable. We have to have a sustainable mechanism, or sustainable. It needs to be sustainable to decarbonize. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. So we need to somehow combine and find a solution. And I appeal to the WTO to help maybe the members to find better ways to deal with it than what is happening for the moment, which is basically just kind of diverging and creating more obstacles than anything else.
Crystal clear. Thank you very much. And actually, it's true that, Adina, you have been mentioning a lot of trade policy tools already. So I would like to push you a little bit down further. Prioritization, maybe, or how we should, you know, that the most difficult thing in this place is to find the agenda. So where would you start?
Well, you know, we keep talking about interoperability here because we need all of these systems to work together and efficiently so that we can facilitate trade. And you know, whether you are aware or not, you know, it's a pretty crowded field in the world and of standards, initiatives, programs, regulations, directives, criteria, and frameworks that are focused just on how do we lower, you know, emissions in the steel industry. And you have two of us up here that have the same goal, that net zero by 2050 goal in mind. And we have many of the same attributes where we build on the ISO, we build on GHG protocol, the IEA stated carbon budget to get there. You know, we may disagree on the progression, but we are supporting the industry to get there. And we can work in concert because of these same frameworks, because of the data that is coming out of the supply chains and the industry. And this is where that steel standards principles as, you know, a convening is what do I want to say, taking advantage of the WTO's convening power to bring us together. About 45% of our membership is developing from the developing countries. So we really do have that balance. And, you know, I think, again, I think it's just about getting to that trade facilitated measure. So is it the environmental goods agreement, or is it a special sectoral, a plurilateral of some sort? Because trade policy can facilitate delivery of low carbon steel, but we also need to create the conditions for that disincentivize dirty steel in the world. You know, there was an effort for a little while, a transatlantic effort, you know, to think about how you can create opportunities for low carbon steel and aluminum trade. Could that evolve into some sort of a plurilateral club? As long as everything is sort of based on regulations that are transparent and science-based, I think a lot of the work that we're doing in the steel standards principles builds on what is already existing. And so that's, I think, a fair starting point.
Very much. Continuing with you, Mark, I think more of the same question a little bit, but from different perspective is we have mentioned the competitiveness, you have mentioned the investment challenge. So what are the tools that you would seek in trade policy for as a priority?
But first, I think I will talk about, you know, the challenges that we have. You just mentioned some, but I think we have three main challenges. We see the availability, affordability, and the validation we need to do. Because sometimes the alternative steel are not the same, exactly the same as the current one. So that's really our three main pain point as of now. So if I start with availability, I have just some key figures. Yeah, we counted around 100 million tons of capacity in a green direct reduction announced over globally by 2030. To put in perspective, I think the market is more specialist than me on that. It's around 1.9 billion tons, something like that, the global steel market in 2024. And it's expected to grow to over 2 billion by the end of the decade. So only the announced capacity is not even covering the expected volume growth. So we are far by decarbonizing the industry so far as we see, at least with this a new method of production. And so that's one thing. We need more offering. Then when it comes to affordability, here it's talk a lot about the cost. I think it's we have the same agenda, right? That you need to be competitive as a steel producer, and we want competitive material to be able to have a customer that can afford our products. So here there is no magical formula, but here we need to make sure that policies help in going that direction. because we see, for instance, in the electrification, if you talk about automotive vehicles, you see that sometimes the acceptance, even though everyone wants to see a greener solution, and at the end, it's still you need affordability. So it's clear that if we want to keep the speed and achieve our leading ambition, then we need to work on that. And we also have some further incentive policy regulation that should help to stimulate to slow emission steel offer. And like if you take in Europe, you have the CBAM regulation that maybe is one step in the right direction to focus, carbon pricing, all the policies that can be around that could be helping to stimulate the greener solution and not make that the traditional one or the one the market is naturally adopting, because the real cost of those solutions are not taken care if you add the environment into the equation. So that's really a two area when we could work on affordability. And the validation, it's maybe one other angle is we also push with our resource pillar into circularity. So we are looking at, it's not only to have a green way of producing new steel from iron, it's also how can we just reuse the scrap, what is existing, and implement that in our industry. Of course, as we have our own challenge because we are long-term driven, product lasts long, so we have very high specification, and it takes typically several years to implement a new solution before it reaches the market. That's why we have no time to lose and we need to act now. But to make it happen, to have more recycled steel, we need more availability, both in quantity but in quality also. And we see that it's topic to the export of scrap that is maybe today happening. If you take Europe again as an example, there's probably a lot of export that maybe some policy could help to stimulate to keep it in the region and also stimulate that the customer will ask for it, because we could not find, for instance, any regulation today that is stimulating the use of scrap in the steel. We start to talk about carbon emission as a figure, but what about the scrap content? So I think this kind of policies could help to solve our challenge. But we have to make it also pragmatic, fit for purpose, because sometimes we see, some new reporting requests and we spend 90% of our time to tackle 10% of the emission, for instance, in reporting, because then it's all or nothing. So maybe we should also help to be a little bit more pragmatic in the demands. But to conclude, the trade policy for us, it's powerful tools and that help to put us and work together in the same objective. We talk about consistency. That's what our customers are expecting.
So facilitating. Annie, what is your take on the same trade policy to ensure transparent and interoperable emissions measurements across the value chains? How do we get there?
So we've talked a lot about the trade in all the raw materials that are needed for green steel, and when we think of trade, whether it's in green iron or steel at a basic level, or in high finished goods, high value finished goods, the embodied emissions in those goods, it's just a question of measurement. So I think the data that is traded with goods alongside goods is just a question of getting to the right level of consistency in measurement. When you want to actually use policy to drive change, then you need definitions, and that's that is a more difficult challenge when you're talking of interoperability. So there, I think you need to bring in questions of national pathways as well as the global average. So we all base definitions on the global average, the IEA's NZE pathway or the MPP's scenarios. And those are all global, but we actually need what countries are doing when they're thinking of their decarbonisation pathways, they're thinking of their national pathways. So if their definitions are based on national pathways, how do you interoperate between these different national definitions. And I think that's a challenge. And for that, you need to unpack it back down to the measurement and then repackage it at the global level in terms of global definitions. So what is the equivalent between, what good looks like in 2030 in the US versus what good looks like in India, for example? They're going to be on different trajectories. So we can measure it in the same way, but in terms of recognizing progress, they may be different, right? So we need a global system that enables that progress to be gauged on the same scale, but in a way that's fair to the levels of development of those countries. And then we can talk the same language when it comes to ambition. So we want globally all steel plants across the world to be at a minimum by 2030 where the average emissions are today. That's the modeling that Responsible Steel's done. So average emissions by 2030 at a minimum, and of course many going to near zero and to lower emission steel. And then we need to design the steel plants for the future to be ready for the future, to be fit for the future. So they need to be capable of going to net zero. So those are all definitions that we can have at a global level. And I think with common measurement systems that feed them, that becomes easier to translate, because this is a common language that we're developing. The measurement is the common language. The definitions are the tools that we need to get there. So if we then have our sights on something like what Adina has outlined, I don't know what you called it, but a sort of free trade agreement that's Paris aligned, right? For Paris aligned steel. That would need to consist of common measurement systems, and I think the interoperability there, as we've said before, is achievable. But then it needs an interoperability between definitions that take into account different levels of development of different countries, but also the end goal of the ambition of net zero. And we need to ensure that the policies that are within that agreement are actually driving progress to net zero, and that's a really critical piece there. And the question is, who would assess that? And I think we're all coming up with our own ideas about what that looks like. I think there's a need for a global assessment of what getting to net zero looks like when it comes to definitions.
Thank you very much, Annie. So global measurement scales and different pathways. I think it's very, very interesting. Do we have time? Okay, I think we can push for, we have 2 or 3 minutes. I would just ask you before opening the floor to really go to quick question. Maybe you ask, you tell us to whom you are addressing and where you are talking from. No statement, please, because we would be kicked out of the room. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Ola Hansen, coming from a company that used to be called H2 Green Steel, but from this morning we are Stegra, a new name. The question I have is, we are going for near zero steel. We are committed to the First Movers Coalition Suppliers Hub. We see, unfortunately, even if we pick the best locations, that going deep green cost more, as we heard here. So putting a price on emissions is crucial for us, and we're sort of, that's why we're placed in Europe. But wanting to go global, how do we find these mechanisms that can create a market for the decarbonized steels in new markets? What kind of policy instruments do you see there, and how to link that to trade? Now we have the CBAM that sort of tries to deal with this in Europe, but how do we deal with it on a global market if other regions or countries introduce similar mechanisms that makes a market for the deep green steel?
Thank you. I don't see any other requests for the floor. So who wants to pick up? Maybe everyone can pick up a little bit on this question very quickly.
Well, firstly, congratulations with a new name. We're very happy to hear this. I agree with your statement that you made that some cost to emissions or some pricing of emissions is potentially important for a global comparative system. We have, as you've said, CBAM as a large example, and I think CBAM plays at the moment much more than just a European role. It is setting an expectation in other regions of the world as well. Many of the countries in this room are evaluating similarly their own, call it CBAM systems, which I am quite confident will come into play sooner rather than later. There are a few locations that are against, but even those locations, I think, will find alternative metrics that eventually will, within the fullness of time, lead to some tradable common measurement of CO2 emissions. For me, the question is, can we find systems around the world that, although different, are, to use the current word, interoperable? In other words, does it allow arbitrage for this costing of emission factors in different markets? Because that, I think, is key to the fact that we move away from this situation that we do not need to subsidize CO2 reduction methods around the world. I think if we have a common arbitrage mechanism, that in itself will force society to take care of the cost of CO2 emissions. Because up till now, society, by and large, for the last 150 years or more, enjoyed the benefit of getting CO2 emissions free of cost. All of us. And it's therefore probably just fair that society as a whole contribute to CO2 costs going forward.
Thank you, Edwin. Any, Dina?
Just to build on that a little bit, I think also, you make a great point. It is that price premium and which is hard to absorb for a lot of consumer groups. And I'm thinking just consumer of the end product itself, and how do you create conditions that will either allow them to accept the higher price in the short term so that you grow the demand, so that over time the unit cost comes down. And how do you stimulate that? And it does take time. I think there are some trade mechanisms that the WTO has utilized over the years where you can focus on, if it's the regulatory sometimes it's the regulatory burdens that build those costs in. So how do you bring some of the regulatory burdens down? This idea of interoperability is an idea towards that goal, where companies are obligated to comply with a whole wide range of programs. Well, if they are able to maybe submit the same amount of data to multiple programs, that lowers their unit costs, and then it's a lower cost that they have to pass on to their consumers. But we can also think about, I talked about a trade facilitation agreement for the steel product, but can you build on the existing trade facilitation agreement to make it easier for the movement of steel using goods to flow, so that their unit costs come down and you can make it more affordable? But I think also there's probably a communications issue. There was a session yesterday, I think, like about how sometimes we as a trade policy community don't communicate very well about what we're doing. The session was called "Why Do Politicians Lie About Trade?" Somebody had written a book about this, but if we're much better about communicating the benefits of trade, then you have a groundswell of support for utilizing trade to make sure that you can bring down costs of products, even where you have some of those initial startup production costs being higher than usual. So anyway, so that's just a couple.
If I can just add one kind of word of warning, the carbon border adjustment is designed to ensure that investments that are made in that domestic market are not undercut by steel that isn't paying that same cost. So the carbon leakage question. And there is a very nice potential dynamic in which the CBAM in Europe is prompting other countries to develop a CBAM. And that CBAM needs to be reflective of the carbon costs in their country. The risk is that they become defensive trade mechanisms. And the risk is they they get used for other purposes. There are other very big tensions in the steel industry of overcapacity, and we need to ensure that carbon policies are designed not to deal with that, but to deal with the climate change issue. They need to be focused on decarbonisation and nothing else. Otherwise, we risk actually missing our targets completely because we're using the wrong instruments for the wrong purpose.
Very important statement in the WTO context. But
yeah, maybe just a comment to you. I mean, I think it's really a very, very relevant question, of course, because the over the midterm, it will continue to be more expensive. And I think one thing is, of course, working on having the same carbon cost everywhere, etc., having a CBAM, etc., etc. But we need to still also work on incentivizing the production and consumption of low carbon steel, and really making sure that this is something that's pushed everywhere, because I mean, it's not only building up scale, because it's not a per unit cost necessarily, it's also the energy cost and the availability, and that's not something that will be done just by producing more. It will take time to build this up everywhere in the world. So in the meantime, I think there will need to be, society needs to kind of take on a higher cost, potentially, probably, because otherwise it's just not happening. And this needs to be ensured everywhere. And I think that is really, really that's why it's a very, very important question, how to ensure this. Yeah, it's pushing both the incentivizing production, but also the consumption, and recognizing that there is a higher cost for the moment, and this will not disappear very quickly.
And it's something, yes, we recognize as a customer, and actually we do have some offtake with your company and with your company, so where we know that there is a premium to pay as of now, but of course in the long run, that's where we need to work together to make it affordable at large scale and for the end consumer, because there is a price to pay to be early adopters and so on, but then we need to be able to scale up. So yeah.
thank you very much. I need to wrap up. If this was an official meeting, my wrap up would be the secretariat take notes of your statement. Thank you very much. So I can keep the thank you very much to our panelists and add what I heard, because this is public forum. First, it's possible. Second, you guys in the private sector have some responsibility for it, but governments also have some responsibility for it. In the trade realm, I think the key word is interoperability, and measurement and methodologies are not a bad place to start, if I understand you correctly, even though there are much more ambitious vision of the agenda. Thank you again very much for your contribution, and thank you all for the conversation.